live, I think. Okay. If we're not, it's too bad. Okay. So, given your theme for your message,
Yes.
I decided to do community patterns, and actually that was kind of inspired by y'all. Because one of the things I like about the Bible, or I like doing with the Bible, and this was part of what I was talking about with Julie not all that long ago, was that I like patterns. So y'all have heard me teach on baptism, that it's been there from the beginning. I actually can do that with a lot of other things too. The Ephesians 4:11 ministry, it's there from the beginning. The church is there from the beginning. We learn that in Ephesians. So if the church was always originally a part of God's plan, then that means that it's all in there. We just have to look for it or dig for it. So what we're going to talk about is community, about the concept of community, and I promise I'm not going to hijack your message too much.
I don't think you will.
This is my thing. I don't read anybody's slides. When y'all put them up, I wait until today, whatever the day is, so I don't read your all slides. I don't know what you said. I know you mentioned Acts 2, and I do mention Acts 2 at one point, but yeah. So what we're going to talk about are definitions of community, and we're going to look at the Greek and the Hebrew for those terms. Yep, because I like those. And we're talking about the Bible. The Webster's Dictionary is not going to help us. So we, well, people get up there, the Webster's Dictionary definition, or better yet, you get someone, the internet defines.
Urban Dictionary.
Urban Dictionary.
Jesus Christ.
Okay. Never mind.
Let's not.
That would definitely get some attention, but okay. So, basic principles of community, things God used to teach community principles, because if God is about community from the beginning, then that means he's been trying to teach about community from the beginning. Okay, and examples of community in the Bible, why it's relevant, we'll have a little Q&A, and then we'll have a little summary with a surprise at the end.
Ooh, surprise.
It's not really a surprise, it's just funny. Okay, so definitions of community. So, in the Bible, the word community is actually found in the NIV, I believe, based on when I looked it up. But it's found under a number of different terms. It's not just under one word. So in the Bible, they talk about fellowship. In the Bible, they talk about the assembly. In the Bible, they talk about the nation of Israel. There isn't just one word that's community over and over and over again. There's a lot of ways it's expressed, and why do we think that is?
Different verse. Oh, yeah. What'd you say?
What?
Different ways to have community.
Yeah, because there isn't just one way that we have community. So in church, most of the time today, we only hear about one or two forms of community. And what are those?
Fellowship.
Do we even hear about that? We hear about marriage, and we hear about heteronormative marriage, which is a very, very important detail. So we hear about marriage, and we hear about family. And often we hear about nuclear family. Yes.
Do we want to explain heteronormative marriage for the folks who may not?
So heteronormative marriage is the idea that marriage is only legitimate or is most desirable when it's with a male and a female. That's the simple definition, right? But we often talk about marriage and family, and it's often nuclear family. Now, how many nuclear families do you all see in the Bible? Wow,
Maybe
quite.
Mary and Joseph.
Well, but that's at the time. That's not necessarily. And actually, if you read text that is apocryphal, they were not nuclear. The theory is that Joseph was a widower and he already had 6 children.
So Jesus was 7.
Now, I've never heard anybody mention that, but yeah, okay. That's a theory. I mean, whether or not that's factual, I don't know, because she was Mary's firstborn. It doesn't say she was his. And even if he was the firstborn and they did have other children, it still would not have fallen in the heteronormative category.
Adam and Eve.
They really weren't heteronormative. I mean, they weren't really nuclear, though.
Mother, father.
there were other people, but I guess we could make the argument that because it was so early in the genetic pool that they were doing things as a family that people would not do now.
And we had to perpetuate the species somehow.
Right. So, I mean, that they would have been involved with relatives, or it wouldn't have fallen in the category that we understand of nuclear families now. In fact, the nuclear family label started in the 1950s. It came into play, the idea of a nuclear family started after World War II as people moved to the suburbs. Before that time, especially prior to World War I, people lived as families. Mm-hmm. And so you would have multiple generations like the Waltons that lived under one roof. And so you had somebody's parents and maybe a cousin. You might have had children that grew up and they still lived at home with their spouse or with their families. You didn't have the concept of nuclear family until the 1950s. And that's why it's called nuclear, as in it's from the nuclear age. So what happened is people started moving away, and they started moving away to places like the suburbs, and they were living by themselves with their children. And then think about all the money that that's created. I mean, I hate to kind of point that out, on travel and holidays and things, because people are all apart. People are not together. Interesting little fact. But that, like I say, how many nuclear families were there? If anything, we see a lot of rather non-traditional families that would be considered tribal in nature by modern standards, that we would use that terminology. So like, for example, I've been doing indigenous religion in my religious encyclopedia. There are tribes still in the Amazon that practice a certain form of marriage where the couple gets married, quote unquote, and they live near or in proximity or in the household of the bride's mother. Now, that's an example of it, and there's a term for it, but I don't remember what it is at the moment. That would be it. Or like, for example, you have the patrilineal lines where which we see in the Bible a lot of the times, where the family gets married and they move in with the husband. They move in with the husband's parents. So, like, for example, Mary and Joseph technically would have had that arrangement where they went off and they lived. She basically stopped being a part of her own family line. And because she was bought basically by that group, that she would go then and be part of that. So we don't really see a lot of nuclear families in the Bible because it wasn't really a thing. I mean, it's not to say that nobody ever did it, because yes, sometimes people moved away or sometimes things happened, but it wasn't the standard. So we often talk about context, and the point of that is that our context of family is not even very communal now. There's a lot of focus on couples, which even that's kind of a new concept historically. We're not going to get into all that, but you see couples and a lot of emphasis on couples and a lot of emphasis on couples and their kids. And we don't really talk about grandparents. We don't really talk a lot about extended family, aunts, uncles. Everything is about those relationships. And what that's actually becoming is the opposite of community, because it's becoming us however many and no more. Or it's like, you had been told that, family's all you're ever going to have, or, it's just us against the world kind of thing. And we're kind of perpetuating those ideas, but we're forgetting that community is more than just us. That community is bigger than just us. So it's found in families, first of all in the Bible, because they were much, much bigger than the ones we have now. And there was a lot of clan association and tribal association, and there was a lot more about survival. You have the nation of Israel. The school of the prophets had a certain level of community to it. And then you've got the Levites had community. They had to in order to do what they were supposed to do. The women of Old Testament times basically kind of did their own thing. They were not part of the public life of Israel. And most relevantly to us, we see most corporately is in the church. So what happened biblically is you had all these little groups. and they represent a community, and then in the church, God just threw everybody together. And if you think about it, what God asked us to do in church is in the natural realm impossible. It is totally impossible that you take all these people with all these differences and all these different understandings and all these different cultures and throw them together in one thing and say, here, get along. But that's what the Spirit's for, the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. There's a reason why.
You are all of it.
That's why all those things go together. Okay, I know that face. So, biblical definitions for community. Cal is an assembly, and so it's typically used in connection with a great multitude. And this is the other thing about translations, is translators tend to translate words very differently depending on context. Like I'm doing, for Jesus People on Tuesday, I'm doing a thing about spirits, and I put up the word for ruach, and it is this long. The definition for spirits is this long. I had to shrink the font because on the slideshow because it's this long. So
It needs its own slide.
it needs its own slide. So, in other words, you've got an assemblage, and they say usually concretely. In other words, it's not used abstract. It's not like, and I saw a great multitude. It's an assembly, a congregation. So the multitude of people who came out of Israel, that was that word. Then you've got Idah, which is a feminine form. And I think that that's important because it's used to state a fixture or a stated assembly. So assembly, company, congregation, multitude, people, swarm. So that's used for the nation of Israel. And one of the things, if you've taken feminist theology, I talk about that Israel's technically a man's name, and it's a male name, but it's a female entity. Yes.
Oh, I just like that.
Kind of interesting, non-binary thing.
A little androgyny going on
Very. There's a lot of it. You have to be paying attention, and you have to study the words and the definitions, but there is a lot of, I guess we could almost say, gender play in a culture that was very binary. But there's a lot of gender play in the words because I don't think that they were binary like the Biblical Council on Manhood and Womanhood. They were binary in that they had gender roles and they had a genderized society. But what that meant was very, very interchangeable depending on the circumstance. So, like, if you're hungry and you don't have no man, you didn't sit on the internet and try to snatch yourself a husband. You went out in the field and you did what had to be done. So I would make that same type of parallel that everybody worked. Everybody did what had to be done. There wasn't this man's work, women's work thing. You know, like someone pointed out, I put that meme in the group about Proverbs 31 woman being a tomboy. I was like, so never thought about it that way because, you know, they have the lily white image, but I was like, yeah. Okay, so is a more primitive word, and it means a brother, so like kindred. So in other words, you've got, these are groups there, and then you've got a more primitive word that relates to basically a brotherly friendship or a brotherly character. So in other words, a community fellowship should not experience strife, but we should treat like a brother. Proverbs 6:19 is that type of level. So then in the Greek, we've got koinonia, which is probably the most familiar term. It's for fellowship. So like we are Sanctuary International Fellowship. And notice that fellowship is, for the most part, in our ministry history, has always been somewhere in our name because we've got a partnership. It's not just a fellowship like we just come together and we hang out and we pay dues, but it's a partnership, a participation, or social intercourse, or benefaction. So in other words, what everybody does is of benefit to everybody else. And that's a really big concept that I think we're not paying attention to enough. And then there's plethos. Now, plethos is a fullness.
Like plethora.
Yes, yes, exactly. So in the Greek, they talk about there is pleroma, I believe is the term, and it's from a very similar thing, which basically means an abundance or an outpouring, like that the fullness thereof. There's a passage, I want to say it's in Ephesians, but I don't remember where it is. A fullness, a large number, throng, populace, bundle, company, or multitude. So all of these words are used for community, or to describe communities, or as part of communities. And I will put this in the Discord so that we can all make reference to it. So what can we tell from these definitions? So whenever the Bible speaks of more than one person, it's always talking about community. Yes?
I was going to ask if there was any elements of the mnemonic and the plethos that you were talking about. Because you said outpouring, so if it comes from the original.
Remember I told you I was talking to Julie about sacred geometry? I mean, I have to give more details than that, which I'm not going to do at the moment. But basically, yes, the concept of the mnemonics and the replication.
So kind of like the Russian doll figures.
Right, and that is exactly the imagery I used with Julie, was that you've got the Russian dolls, and they are each kind of had their own characteristics, but they are all basically a replication in certain ways of a certain idea. Yeah, and the more that we talk about all this stuff, if we're going to talk about community, and I think that the bottom line from the sacred geometry thing was about patterns, that we are supposed to be replicating certain things for those who believed he gave the right to be called the sons of God. That's a mnemonics. That's a replication with a little bit of a difference of a divine pattern or a divine idea, and we don't tap into a lot of that. But community is very much that concept. It's replicating an idea among people, or replicating a concept. So, whether in immediate couple, a family, a clan, a tribe, a collective group, nation, church, or group, community is always present. So, community is one of these underlying principles. And there's almost always a spiritual connotation to community. And I think that that's important. So, what I would say is that distinguishes good ideas and groups that do things that are really good from actual communities. So what a lot of people don't know, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard it because it's not spoken of as much, have any of you ever heard of groups like AA or the 12-step groups as they define themselves as a fellowship? Okay. They say that that they consider themselves to be a fellowship. Okay.
Maybe like an academia, but.
Oh, AA definitely not. A fellowship, well, that's a different context, but yes,
Okay.
that is a correct use of the word. You're right. But if you look at the history of AA, they were a fellowship. In fact, they all got started living in the founder's house with his wife, and they were all figuring out how to stay sober. So they literally were a fellowship. They were literally a group that lived like we talk about, and that had that kind of foundation. And so they talk about it now as a spiritual fellowship based on that tradition. And so there's always a spiritual connection to community if it's done right. If it's not done right, then most stuff doesn't wind up making it. But it's the idea that the group should embody certain ideas and principles within its governance that relate to a larger sense of spiritual belief. So community is a spiritual principle because God gave it. It's not our idea. And you know, anybody can get any lame-brained idea to get together and do something. I mean, look at the Tower of Babel and look at how God took care of that. I think sometimes a lot of things people try, God takes care of, but we don't see it that way. Anyway, that's another point. All right, so community is found family. We could use the Adam and Eve example. They kind of found each other. It's like, oh, hey, you look like me. Nick's taking notes.
For Twitter.
Oh, you're tweeting. Okay,
I'm doing
twittering.
Highlights.
Tweeting. Oh, cool. Okay. So basic principles of community. I had my first apostle used to say there are no cowboys in the kingdom. And that has always really, really, really kind of stuck out with me, even though she said that like 15 years ago. It still stuck with me because there is no just me and Jesus in community. And isn't that the major thing that we find on the internet? Oh, it's just me and Jesus, so I don't need church, I don't need this, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that, and we just sit there and we do this. It's like, oh God, not again. Well, and people like that you can't really argue a whole lot with. But God puts us in a body. We are saved to be in a body. And it's like I say, if we are baptized into Christ and we are baptized into his body, then we are also baptized into this fellowship. We are baptized into each other. And so there is no, I'm just going to go off and do it the way I want to do it. And that's a very American ideal. I'm also going to throw that in there. That what have we often said about independence and stuff that we've always talked about, that the cowboy out on the plains all by himself, rallying up all the cattle, singing by the campfire with a cast iron skillet and some gross in it that we all don't want to eat, like,
Rattlesnake.
there we go. What's the most disgusting thing you can think of? There we go. Rattlesnake and singing. What's a campfire song?
Oh, yeah.
You watch these movies, I don't watch them.
Home on the Range.
Home on the Range, perfect. Home on the Range, and he's sitting there, and there's a wolf that befriends him, or a fox, I don't know, something, and he saves the day, and he saves the girl, and he drinks whiskey like it's water, and
It's very Disney.
what?
The romanticizing of the cowboy.
It's very romantic, and it's very inaccurate. It was rough, it was hard, people died, people smelled, people didn't bathe. It was not a Disney movie where the
They
bluebirds came and sang zippity-doo-dah.
They weren't all white.
No, they were not all white. You are correct. A lot of them were Hispanic, too. And now, we are starting to entertain the idea that some of them were black, but we still haven't gotten to that. They were herders, especially if you're talking Texas, and once upon a time, Texas belonged to Mexico. So you have people crossing borders, and there's a whole level of this that we do not talk about. And then we have like some of the shows my mom has watched where the sheep herders didn't like the ranchers, didn't want them on the water, didn't want them to use their resources. So ain't nobody ever liked nobody. It's for real here. But we have a romantic version of that independence, of that untamed, wild, very country, white, male identity about the West. And that is the ultimate in freedom and the ultimate in American ideals, and you don't need anybody in this, that, and something else. Well, that's not biblical. So the reason we are in the body is to work together for the common good, to recognize that we can do more together and to share it. Now, I don't mean any of that idealized. I do not mean that romanticized. The fact is that doing all that is really, really hard. And the reason why, like I say, what God has asked us to do is impossible in the natural is because it is hard. That God has us do these things because it's hard. Why do people get married? Oh, because they're in love. Well, they ought to be thinking about it being hard. And I don't mind it being hard like everybody said, oh, it's hard, it's hard, it's hard, it's hard, it's hard. I mean that when we are confronted with community, it forces us to develop holiness. And I'm going to speak a little bit on that in a minute. So, address the rough edges we all have as part of our personalities and our lives. I've heard it described as, yes.
Not as quack. Anyway, continue.
I've heard it described as sandpaper.
Iron sharpens iron.
yeah.
Yeah, that's how I've heard it described. Now, to develop holiness, and I make a statement here, to find community, we must first find separation. Now, I'm going to explain that. Yes, Nick, you look like you're going to explode if you don't say something.
No, I'm just processing what you say.
Oh, okay. You took this big breath and you made that moo face.
No, it's just like, I feel like I have an idea of where you're going with it, but
What are you thinking about?
we have to separate from the things that hold us back.
And we have to separate from the things that are not good for us.
Woohoo.
And that's actually going to wind up in my blog, because that I said I'm going to work on that I haven't done yet. That in order to develop holiness, in order to draw, we have to first draw away from. And that is whether it was the nation of Israel and their neighbors, which were not good for them, or it's us and the things that are not good for us, or it's the things that are holding us back. We have to find that place of I'm going to say self-awareness to the point where we can develop this basic principle of doing what we need to do. So in community, we don't get our own way. In community, we don't get to control everything. We don't get to dictate everything on our terms. We don't get to have everything our own way. And we know that we have dealt with people like that who have very definite ideas about stuff and try to conform things to their will. And what happens? Need to separate because I'm going to get holy with you round kind of thing. That's exactly the type of thing that starts to happen because it cannot be all on any one person's terms or it doesn't work. Or it's not community. We all have to give, we all have to take, we all have to find, like we said, it's a mutual process, like we talked about in the word koinonia. So, in community, we also have to have a certain sense of governing and rule. And so we have to find through community accountability and structure. We are not going to find accountability and structure by ourselves. It's very, very easy to think that the voice of God is just a big version of everything you want God to say. And you would be amazed at the number of people who go off on their own with no accountability, and everything that they think they hear, everything that they believe, they think is God. When it's just a big version of them. They hear themselves talk. So they ultimately find God in every situation as we share about Him. So we start to learn all the ways we're seeing the sacred geometry, all the ways that we start to kind of figure and discover things out. We find God in every situation that we're in. And to know, love, and worship God and serve Him. Okay, so things God used to teach community principles, so family life. And it's like I've said, if you consider family life in Bible times next to today, there was a lot more politics. And what I mean by that is everything was negotiations. It was alliances, it was family defenses, it was trying to figure out how are we going to be nice to this invader, or are we going to fight this invader? Do we have the ability to do it? Who should you marry so that we don't have to fight them anymore? It was all these types of arrangements, and so family life was very, very arranging all the time, but it was also survival based. They weren't, oh, I want to get married because I'm bored. It was, we're going to get married because if we don't, we're going to die. Or we're going to have kids because we need free farm hands. It wasn't the type of arrangements that we have now. So the festivals in the Old Testament were very, very, very community based. And they helped to teach different spiritual principles, but they also forced everybody to come together and eat things and worship God and have assemblies and think about salvation and think about different things. The sacrifices present in the Mosaic Law, a lot of them were community oriented. You had a trespass offering and a sin offering and an offering when you hurt somebody and you didn't intend to. And there were a lot of them that were about offenses and about trying to make, they had the concept that God was in the situation, even if maybe it was just between two people, that they still didn't do right by God if they did something wrong. Yes?
It was just a lot of animals. No, I just never thought about that with how many offenses and laws they had back then. What was it, like 600 plus?
Well, they weren't, all of the laws did not have the same penalties.
Okay.
But some of them were not animals. Like one of them, I'm thinking of, the one between a trespass was actually flour, I think. Flour or corn or something. No, it couldn't have been corn. It must have been like flour and
Maybe grain.
some type of grain, yeah. Maybe wheat.
A lot of food.
A lot of food. Oh no, there was a lot of food. You're going somewhere with that, aren't you?
No, it's just, I mean, with as survival oriented as they were back then, to have food be the sacrifice is kind of telling.
Because
Yeah.
it
It was a
said the
sacrifice.
Levites, like the Levites
Right.
got all of the sacrifices.
Right.
So it supported somebody. It wasn't like going to waste.
Right. Right, it wasn't like we just, I guess that there were a couple that they burned the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like you burned everything. I remember thinking about this and it must have smelled, okay? Like you had to burn the bones and the hide and you like burned everything. But there were not many like that. And yeah, them doing all that, it was a sacrifice. It was a representation of livelihood. It was, a lot of people make the argument about stuff, it was the equivalent of the offering or the tithe today in that context. It absolutely was, because it was a sacrifice for them to do all that. Yep. A lot of food. Okay, so the socializing aspects would be the community regulations. So, don't poop where you eat. Go outside the camp. Wash your clothes before you do, if certain things touch them. You know, if you're sick or you have a sore, don't go around everybody and have everybody touch it, okay? Those were community principles because people could get sick. Okay, so the prophets and their prophecies against injustice were very community minded. If we think about Israel, when they talked about the poor or them exploiting people like we looked at in the minor prophets, that they're taking the offerings and they're using them for non-spiritual purposes, that, and they were exploiting people in the process. And so the inclusion of Gentile figures pre-church and then the inclusion of everyone in church. So for example, Rahab or Ruth would have been Gentile inclusions. I'm trying to think, there are others, but those are the most obvious ones. So I was thinking of those memes, and you're laughing because you know the memes I mean, right?
I'm laughing at Adam and Eve up there.
Oh, isn't that great? So,
Eve about to model down the runway over there.
oh my goodness, she has it on her head. Okay, yeah. All right. That gives me an idea. Okay. It does. Okay, anyway. So, remember those memes that say, like, being a minister, and it
Yeah,
says,
what people think I do.
what, right, so what people think I do, what my mom thinks I do, what the internet thinks I do, right, so this is what it made me think of. So these are examples of community in the Bible. So you have Adam and Eve, like you say, they were there and they had community. Adam already had a bunch of animals. I think it's funny that, you know, it's like we say, can you imagine what he must have been like by himself? Anyway, so they were a community. God gave somebody like Adam. Okay. So the nation of Israel was a community. You have friendship, and there's examples of that. The need of others, which is that passage in Ecclesiastes about.
That's my benediction. Thank you.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Chuck's benediction. Okay. So the prophecies of judgment, the Jerusalem church in Acts, the church as a whole, and then we've got the remnant. Is also community and actually is a whole kind of different concept of community. And so why is community relevant? It breaks through cycles of alienation and toxic independence all by itself. The total answer to that is community. So it focuses our goal to advance God's kingdom. Principles before personalities is the term that they would use for that in 12-step. In other words, it's not necessarily always about how much we like people. It's about that they're there for a purpose. Corporate worship is good for us. It's a blessing before God and the congregation. It establishes patterns so as to ensure future generations know God, and every one of us needs found family. Any questions? Okay. So our summary is God has given us community because we need it. Communities, though often all a little different, serve the same purpose to help people find spiritual purpose, grow and learn from one another, and develop the essential principles of holiness that we cannot develop on our own. And I quoted from a book I recently released for somebody, Nobody Succeeds Without the Help of Others. And so that is it.